This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Though by then militarily obsolete, the design of the old fort was reproduced in the great castles that the Habsburgs either commissioned or rebuilt in Spain, in Toledo and Madrid, and it was carried to the Americas. In Mexico, the blockhouse with 4 towers was a mark of the power wielded by the first royal governors. Lesser men had to be content with just 2 towers. In the Holy Roman Empire, over which the Habsburgs ruled as emperors, and which is very roughly where Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic are today, ambitious princes also built 4-tower keeps as a way of communicating their own prestige. The Habsburgs were the first rulers whose power encompassed the world, and they achieved greatness by luck and by force. The 4-tower keep was in the 16th century an expression of their physical mastery of a part of Europe, and by its reproduction overseas, evidence of their global dominion. But it was only one symbol among many that the Habsburgs deployed, for they conceived of their power as both something that they had been predestined for, and part of the divine order in which the world was arranged. This required a subtler symbolism than a threat in stone. The rebuilding of the Hofburg in the early 18th century, which saw the old fort finally disappear from the horizon, included the construction of the court library, Hofbibliothek. Previously, the Imperial Library had been housed in an abandoned friary in Vienna, in the wing of a private palace, and in a wooden structure in the shadow of the old fort on today's Josefsplatz. The librarians complained of the damp, the dust from the street, the inadequate lighting, and the fire hazard. But it was only during the long reign of Charles VI, 1711 to 1740, that the Imperial Library found a permanent home on a space immediately south of what had been the old fort. The new library building was put up in the 1720s, and it remains much the same today as Emperor Charles VI intended. Some 200,000 books and manuscripts were shelved in a single hall, 75 meters, 250 feet long. By this time, the collection included works on theology, church history, law, philosophy, science, and mathematics, and bound manuscripts written in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Armenian, and Coptic. Charles opened his library to scholars, although they had to apply for permission, and visiting hours were restricted to mornings. In return for this act of generosity, Charles imposed a tax on newspapers. Originally temporary, to cover the cost of building, the tax soon became permanent, being ostensibly dedicated to future acquisitions. Printers were also expected to furnish the library with copies of every book they produced. Since many Viennese printers also dealt in pornography, this was an obligation that was often shirked. In the centre of the library stands a life-size marble statue of Charles VI, portrayed as Hercules of the Muses. The dome ceiling above depicts his apotheosis or elevation to the heavens and celebrates his achievements with allegorical figures. Unlike George Washington, whose apotheosis is shown on the rotunda of the United States Capitol building, no portrait of Emperor Charles stares down at us from the ceiling. Charles was still alive when the artist began work, and so not yet received in heavenly glory. But a floating figure bearing a laurel crown waits for him, leaving us in no doubt that Charles will at his life's end be received in the company of angels and will sit among them in the clouds. The marble statue of Charles VI was joined on the floor of the library by 16 statues of Habsburg emperors, kings, and archdukes, starting with the 13th century King Rudolph and finishing with Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700. Marble statues are expensive items to commission, so most were taken from the Hofburg storerooms and gardens. Over time they were added to and swapped with statues in other imperial palaces. The earliest historian of the court library was critical of the original selection, for he considered too many of the 16 statues to recall Habsburg rulers who had shown no special interest in study or learning. Clearly, he imagined that a library should have something to do with books.